स्वाध्याय टीवी. डॉक्टर बाबासाहेब आंबेडकर ओपन यूनिवर्सिटी.
Namaskar. Welcome again in the series of a lecture regarding the part of GPSC exams. We were already discussing the previous parts regarding the part of accountancy, in which we were taking a subject regarding the cost accounting, and we already discussed a few parts and few sessions regarding the cost accounting units. Here today I am going to start a new units, and that is process costing. Process costing is also one part of or one type of a method which is actually used by the manufacturer or a producers who are actually producing and manufacturing the different type of goods which are actually related to a continuous process of the goods in their units, which would be helpful and identified the cost to be manufactured units in the premises, and the how this process has been actually continuously without any interruptions, the continuous flow of a manufacturing has been started, and how the cost has been identified of a different process. The process costing is a one type of a method which will be used by the different type of a manufacturer for their requirement to identify the how the cost can be determined of each process when the productions are on. So let's begin with this different type of topics to be discussed in this particular unit, and the different topics like introduction, meaning, definitions, calculation of a process cost, how the cost has been calculated and which type of way the cost can be classified and calculated, then the features of a process costing and the elements of cost which are actually mainly used in the process costing. So let's begin with this part, and the topics has been discussed with. Let's begin with the introduction and meaning. What is process costing? It is ultimately a part of a costing which has been accumulated a different type of work and different type of cost and expenditures of each department and each processes for the particular period of a time, which is called a process costing, or which is known as a process costing. It means that there are a series of expenditures incurred as in a different level as well as in the different departments. So each department has a certain amount of expenditures which has to be accumulated and which is to be calculated add on in the part of the expenses, and in that way the total amount of expenditures incurred for each department as well as in each process accumulated, which is known as a process costing. Here the process costing has been actually calculated for the different processes. That means the manufacturer and producer has to be identified that the in a particular product has been divided into a how many number of processes. It depends. The number of manufacturer or maybe manufacturer has to be identified that the how many process to be required for the particular unit of manufactured. So in that sense, if there are requirement of 4 processes, then all different 4 processes has to be identified the amount of elements of cost. Which type of elements of cost has been actually required to identify? That may be a material cost or a labor cost or overheads, and different type of overheads is also a part of the different process costing. So this each cost has been identified for the particular process, and according to this particular cost to be required and recorded into each process individually, and then the applications of the cost unit to be identified, the how many number of units are manufactured of the particular product, and according to that the what would be the cost per unit to be determined. So the cost per unit has been determined on the basis of the total amount of cost has been incurred for the each process divided by the number of units inputs in the respected process, in which in this way that can be identified the cost per unit of the each process. Why they are willing to know that the cost per unit for each process? Because of the what amount of expenditures are incurred of each process as well as the how much amount of proportionate profit has to be added into the respected process. That is also the one part of the things. Then the another important thing is the which type of industries are actually involving with this particular method. Now, there are many industries to be identified to involving in this particular manufacturing process, because of the particular company who are actually involving with the manufacturing, their manufacturing process has been continued. So, it means that if they are having a continuous manufacturing process and if they are manufactured a bulk number of units in their premises, they are supposed to use this particular method. That means that if they have a uniform method for the manufacturing products, which is not as such differentiated of their manufacturing product, then they are supposed to use for the particular method, like foundries, blast furnaces, chemical companies, oil refineries, different type of beverages, sugar mills, textile industries. These are the industries or manufacturing companies are maybe use this method, and it will be useful for them to identify a different type of cost structures. Now, as we already identified that the process costing has been actually identified for the different type of manufacturing company. Now, how this manufacturing process or a production process has been helpful for the particular company. They are actually involving with the single commodity manufactured product, or it is manufactured in a bulk, or it may be manufactured in a group. So, this is the way they can actually identify the manufacturing process in this premises. Now, they have a distinctive features of a process costing is that the unit cost has to be identified, that the product are determined for the respective process through which the unit has been passed. So, that means the as we already discussed, maybe the company is actually identified the different processes for the manufacturing of product. Now, which part of process has been required a different type of inputs, and the what type of cost has been incurred in the different process. It is maybe the different type of expenditures and cost has been incurred in a different processes or in a different stage at different level. So, that they need to identify the cost of a product manufactured and the different type of elements to be inputs in the different processes. Then the next is all the cost has been related to the different processes identified, which is to be recorded in the respected process account. Means that there are certain expenses incurred jointly, not even that, it may be incurred for a whole unit. So, the company and the manufacturer has to identify the expenses to be allocated according to their nature or according to their part of interest in the respected process. It means that if the expenditures are having some part of interest into the respected manufacturing product as well as in the respected process, then the proportionate expenditures to be identified. Now, how the proportionate expenditures can be identified? It would be identified on the basis of a number of units manufactured in the particular process. And on the basis of the number of units, the proportionate expenses identified, and it would be recorded into the respected process account. The another important thing is the purpose of this particular, they need to identify the average cost and average costing of the total amount of costing. It means that the amount of cost has been included with the raw material expenditures, wages, overheads, other direct expenditures and other expenses which are actually allocated to the respected process account. But the whole cost is actually included in the different parts or in a different stage or in a different level or in a different departments. Then at the end of all the processes are over, there would be a total cost. And the total cost is actually a represent of a total amount of cost per unit. How it would be identified the cost per unit? The total cost has been divided by the number of units has been manufactured in the respected process account, and then you will identify the cost per unit. Now, at the end of this, the one department is actually identified, the respected amount of cost incurred in that particular process becomes a raw material for the preceding process, or you can say in the next process, or you can say in the next department. It means that the cost of each process or the finished goods of each process becomes a raw material for the preceding process. In this way, the cost has been added multiple the different departments. That means in each department maybe a raw material cost is incurred, wages or a production wages has been incurred, or maybe you can identify the other expenses too. So in this way the total cost has been identified. So this is the basic things of the process costing. Now what is the definition of the process costing? The costing method which is actually applicable to identify the cost of goods or services which has been involving in a sequence or continuous process of a manufacturing, which is actually involved of a different level of output or a different level of a departmental activity for averaging a cost of units for the producing a goods, which is called a process costing. It means that there are many basic characteristics can be identified. One is it is a continuous process, then you can identify it is a sequence of process, then you can identify it may be a manufacturing involving with the goods or services, or then you can identify the averaging a cost. Averaging a cost, it means that the cost has been divided between the departments or between the activities, or you can say the between the process. So in this way the main object behind the process costing is to identify the total cost of each process or operation to understand the what amount of a product cost at the end of each stage. So at the end of each level or in each department, what amount of cost has been incurred and how much amount of cost is incurred at the end of each process, that is the main object to applied a process costing. And that is why the manufacturer and producer is used actually a process costing who are actually involving the manufacturing in a different processes they are having. Moving to the next point, and that is a characteristics. Now the characteristics has been designed on the basis of a definition only. How the characteristics actually to be identified? The definition is shows very clear in characterize of the particular process costing. One is the in a process costing, it's always a continuous process of a manufacturing, or you can say that it's a continuous process of a production level. So where the manufacturing units are observing a continuous level of production, that is considered a process costing method, or you can say the process costing method can be applied where the manufacturing has been continuously done. The second is the finished product of a one process. As I already mentioned earlier, the finished product of a one process or a one department or a one activity becomes a raw material for the subsequent process. That means for the next process. Taking an example very simply, suppose if there is an activity where the three processes are required, and the process 1 is already done, where the total amount of raw material cost, wages cost and other overheads cost are already incurred in the first process, make a total of the total expenditures of the each process. Now at the end of the process 1, where the process 1 has already over, that means we don't have any further part of an activity for the process 1, and after the process 1 end, whatever the total amount of the process 1, it's called a finished product of the process 1 becomes a raw material for the process 2. So it means that the another important characteristic of this process costing is the raw material of first process or a raw material of the current process or a finished goods of a first process becomes a raw material for the preceding process, and the amount it would be carry forward till the end of the process. At the end of the final process, whatever the output and outcome has been identified at the end of each process or at the end of the final process, it would be considered as a finished goods, and that would be transferred to the finished goods account. Another characteristic is the products cannot be differentiated in the different level. It means that whatever the inputs has been given into the respected process account, it will be identified at the end of the last process only. So you cannot differentiate, you cannot actually distinguish the part of the process account which is to be identified in a different stage. So the product which was actually manufactured in the process account would be identified at the end of the particular process only. So you cannot differentiate it between the process account or in between the process stage also. Then the another characteristic is that you can identify that the process accounts may be conveniently divided depending upon the process of a manufacturer only. It means that the manufacturer or a producer has to identify that how many processes has been required to manufacture of the particular product, and according to that the number of processes has been divided, and then they can identify the elements of cost of each process also. Maybe some processes require the raw material inputs in the first process itself only, then the production wages would actually require in the second process onwards only, maybe some add-on raw material has been required in the second or third process only. So all these things has been identified by the manufacturer or producer only, and then they have to actually prepared according to the requirement, and the product has been divided into the number of manufactured processes. Moving to the next part is, maybe some part or sometimes you can identify, or maybe the many industries have a manufacturing process in a continuous flow only. So it means that once the raw material has been input in a first process, at the end of a second process or a third process or maybe a fourth process, the finished goods come out. But sometimes there are a simultaneous parallel some processes has been done, and at the end or before the last process, that both the simultaneous process or parallel process has been merged. It means that some manufacturers, suppose I want to take an example to manufacturing automobiles or maybe manufacturing of a car. So in manufacturing of a car, there are certain processes has been actually going parallel. It means machineries has been actually manufactured somewhere, maybe the body of the car has been actually manufactured in the premises of the particular unit, maybe their seats and other things has been manufactured simultaneously somewhere else, maybe the tires and other things has been manufactured simultaneously somewhere else. And before you can actually find out that the whole things has been actually merged, before that the things has to be identified, the all processes are actually worked parallel simultaneously, and before the last process all this individual part or a separate part has been merged, and then at the end of the finished products to be identified. So in this way some manufacturing units have a parallel process or simultaneous process, and before the end of the finished products it will be merged, and then they can actually assembled of the product and finished product would be identified. So these are the characteristics of the process costing. So we already identified the characteristics of the different process accounts, which is actually a continuous process, elements cost has been designed, manufacturer has to identify how many processes has been required, some processes may be continuously going, some processes may be actually worked parallelly. So according to that they has to design the part of the process costing unit or a process costing method for the respective manufacturing product. Now moving to the next part, that is cost determination. Cost determination means how the cost has to be calculated for the respected product. Now see here there are few steps for the calculation of calculation of a cost for the particular product. Now how the cost has been determined and how the cost can be identified for the particular product, and how the process costing method would be helpful for the manufacturer to calculate the cost, because there are many features and many points would be considered at the time of calculation of a process costing. See, the first point is the total production has been divided in a different processes. As I already mentioned in the characteristics, the company or a manufacturer or a producer has to identify how many processes, how many operations, how many departments are required to manufacture this product. So that means the whole production process has been divided into a different parts, and that parts has been identified along with the cost or elements of cost, which is actually precisely identified for the respected department or a respected process or a respected unit. Then the separate account has to be maintained for the each process. Now as we are taking simply here, instead of the department or you can say process or individual case, I am taking an example that's here each process. Now we will actually take in a part of each process has to be identified, and the cost has to be identified for each process. Now the second process is the cost has been identified of each process. As I mentioned, maybe the raw material has been input in the first process, In the second process onwards, maybe wages has to be identified. So the producers are actually identified, the workers who are actually try to convert the raw material into a finished product will begin from the second process onwards only. Maybe in the third process or in another process, some add-on materials were also required, and it is input in the third process or maybe in the fourth process, and at last they will identify the finished products. So in this way, the total amount of expenditures to be identified and the cost has to be identified in the each process. So the separate account would be prepared for each process, and the raw material and other expenditures to be recorded at the respected process, and at the end of each particular period or at the end of the each process period, the total amount of expenditures has been designed. Now next is, as I already mentioned, there are three elements. One is direct material or maybe indirect material also, direct wages, indirect wages, and the overheads. So first process is actually identified with the materials, which is already recorded, and for that we already prepared a separate process accounts. Then the second part is wages, and the third is overheads. Now the second process or maybe in the different process account, we identified the production wages or other wages as well as the other overheads also, and all these expenditures we need to identify in which process account these expenditures are incurred, and according to the identifications it would be recorded into the respected process account. So now in the particular period or at the end of the period, all these expenditures which was actually identified, it is to be recorded in the respected process account, maybe in the process 2 or maybe in the process 3. So now these expenditures are recorded in the respected process accounts, and at the end of each process we need to identify the total amount of cost of each process. And now the another calculation is the total amount of each process expenditures or a total cost of each process would be transferred into the next process or in the preceding process, which is actually a part of a continuous flow of manufacturing. So now the total amount of cost of a particular process would be transferred into the preceding process or in the next process, it becomes a raw material for the next process, as we already discussed in the characteristics also. So finished good of one process becomes a raw material of the preceding process. Now there is something else is also input. Moving to the next point, and how it would be calculated. That is very important. In calculation of the process accounts, there are certain other parts also considered at the time of a calculation, which is actually identified the amount of a quantity to be calculated in a different units. It means that when you are actually calculated the cost, you need to identify in which units this cost has been calculated. Without units to be identified, cost may not be calculated easily for the respected process account. So that means that before you start the process accounts, you need to identify the units of a process account also. It may be in a ton, it may be in a kilograms, it may be in a liters, it may be in a units, it may be in identification of a number of pieces, anything in any format, but you need to identify the number of units before you are actually start the process accounts. So the process accounts would actually more helpful at the time of when you are actually identified the number of units before you start the process account. Now after you identified the number of units, which may be a kilograms, liter, or any format, then you need to identify the another important features, that is whether the company have a certain amount of an abnormal or a normal losses. That means there would be some part of discriminations to be identified because of the number of units has been input in the first process. It is not compulsory that, or it is not necessary that at the end of a last process the same number of units will come out. So in between, if there would be any possibility of losses, that the losses has to be identified. Now this losses may be a normal or abnormal also. So there are three main differences, maybe the normal loss and then abnormal loss, or instead of any of these two, there would be abnormal gain also. So how the normal loss can be identified, or normal scrap or normal wastages also. How the normal loss can be identified? Maybe due to a evaporation or a shrinkages. It would be specially applied for an oil or petrol, or because of evaporation and shrinkages may be possible in this particular type of goods only. So due to evaporation or shrinkages, if anything has been damaged or anything has been lost out, which would be considered a normal loss. So in case of the any amount of units has been reduced at the end of each process which was not similar to the inputs units due to a normal circumstances, it is called normal loss. So, that in case of a normal circumstances, any amount of units has been decreased, that difference is considered a normal loss. That normal loss we already identified, and normal loss has to be calculated for the normal values also, or in the normal values as per the scrap value or in a normal sale value also. Then the second possibility is abnormal loss. How the abnormal loss can be identified? Abnormal loss can be identified in case of the any amount of loss which is actually incurred more than the normal wastages. Normal wastages, it means that suppose we assume that now which type of abnormal loss, maybe due to some amount of maybe the material has been sent in a transportations, and due to the accident some amount of material and some amount of units has been lost out, or maybe damaged, or maybe not identified, maybe theft, or any other reasons which are actually abnormal reasons. And due to the abnormal reasons, if you identified the some losses, we need to identify the value of abnormal losses, and if the value of abnormal losses is more than the normal value of losses, that difference is considered the abnormal wastages or abnormal loss, and this abnormal loss has to be transferred in costing profit and loss account at the end of the particular process account. The third possibility is abnormal gain. It's a reverse situation than the abnormal loss. Reverse situation, it means that in case of the abnormal wastages is lesser than the normal wastages, that means the normal wastage we assume that its amount suppose 100 rupees, and abnormal wastages amount is 50 rupees, which is lesser than the normal wastages, the difference is considered an abnormal gain. It means that the manufacturer actually identified there should be 100 rupees loss, but instead of the 100 rupees loss, the loss was lesser than that, that is 50 rupees. So, the difference amount is considered as an abnormal gain. It would be happen sometimes because of the amount of selling value of abnormal wastages is higher than the value of the loss. In this case, the abnormal gain has been find out, and this abnormal gain would be recorded in the respected process account, and at the end of this process this is also has to be transferred into the costing profit and loss account. So, this is the way for the calculation of the part of abnormal loss, normal loss and normal wastages. Moving to the next point, and this next point is actually identified the calculation of CPU. This is very much important, how the cost per unit is calculated. Very simple way the cost per unit is calculated, and this is very important point. Now, the cost per unit is calculated difference between the total amount of cost divided by the total inputs or total units introduced in the respected process. Now, see here, there are possibilities of normal loss and normal wastages also. Suppose in case of any processes have a normal loss or a normal wastages, then the total cost, the CPU can be find out in this way. See the formula is very clear, the total cost minus the value of a normal loss. How you can identify the value of normal loss? The value of normal loss can be identified through the normal wastages units multiplied by the selling value or a sales price of a normal wastages. So, that in this way the value of normal wastages can be identified, or value of normal loss can be identified, would be deducted from the total cost, divide by the total input. Total input, it means the how many number of units introduced in the respected process account minus the normal loss units, and this normal loss units would be deducted from the total inputs. In this way the cost per unit can be determined. So, the CPU has been identified and CPU would be calculated through this way. Then the next is the cost is actually calculated and transferred to the subsequent process accounts. We already transferred the process one by one into the subsequent process account, but the most important part is the whenever you transfer this total cost at the end of the particular process, it would be transferred finally to the finished goods account and a finished stock account. It means that the amount of the process would be transferred at the end of all processes, transferring to the finished stock account. And the formula and the journal entries for this finished transferring into the finished stock account is the finished goods account is debited to the last process account. as we already understood that at the different part of a process also transferring into the next process account, the respected process will be debited. Suppose I told you the first process finished goods becomes a raw material for the process 2. When you are going to transfer this, there would be a journal entry is process 1 account debited to the process 2 account. So, this is a very simple formula. So, in this way the amount of formula has to be transferred at last also when all the complete process has been done and we identified now this is a finished goods. So, then the formula is finished stock account debited to last process account. So, this is the way to identify the journal entries of the prospected process account. Moving to the next point, then there would be a chance of a work in progress also. Work in progress, it means the some amount of process has been already done on this particular product or raw material, but still there are some processes is required to identify the finished goods also, or maybe some process has been required to convert this raw material into a finished product. In this way, we need to calculate the work in progress value also, and this value will be calculated on the basis of the material, labor and other overheads which was actually charged into the respected process account. The all proportion of the different elements of cost would be helpful to calculate the work in progress value, and this work in progress amount would be charged in the respected process accounts. So, at the end of this particular process, work in progress value has to be recorded into the respected process account, and everything at the end of everything, whatever the amount of a profit received of the respected process, whether it is an abnormal loss, an abnormal gain or any other part of a losses and gain would be transferred to costing profit and loss account. So, this costing profit and loss account would be helpful to identify the net amount of profit and loss at the end of all the different processes. So, this is the way to calculate the cost in a process account. So, this is a determination of a cost calculations in if you applied a process costing method in manufacturing unit. Now, moving to the next point, and that is the features of process costing. As I think so, we already discussed all these parts. This is maybe we need to identify which are the features in the process accounts. The first is we need to identify the transfer of production to another process. As we already discussed, this is a continuous flow of a manufacturing of a product. It means that the process 1, it's a first part of manufacturing process product, then the second process, then the third, or maybe at last process also. Ultimately, it's a continuous flow of product. So, the finished goods of first process becomes a raw material of the second process, and in the same way the third process or a fourth process would be transferred into a finished product account. So, ultimately the finished product of a respected process would be transferred into the next process, would be considered as a raw material. This is your first feature. Then wastage or losses, we need to identify there are normal loss, maybe abnormal loss, abnormal gain. So, according to these calculations, whatever the input units is actually introduced in the respected process and the how many units were come out from at the end of the particular process, the difference between the inputs and output of the respected process, it is your abnormal loss or a abnormal gain. Right. So, we need to identify the normal loss and abnormal wastages by the comparison of the inputs and output of the respected process, and in this way the finished goods has to be identified at the end of the particular all processes, and generally we need to identify the calculation of the whole abnormal gain and abnormal wastages on the basis of whatever the amount of a raw material has been introduced in the respected process. Another important feature is byproducts. Now, what is a byproduct? The byproduct is actually a product which is not identified or product which is not a main object to manufacture. It means that the company is manufacturing a product, in that along with that if any more products has been manufactured along with your main products which is not identified as well as which is not required also, that is your byproduct. It means that the byproduct is the product which is manufactured or produced along with the major product or a main product. it may be defined as any sellable or a usable value incidentally produced in addition to the product. It is called a byproduct. Now ultimately the byproduct is your income, or it is maybe a sellable value also, which is to be recorded in the respected process account where the byproduct has been identified. So the byproduct is actually a part of features which is to be identified in the respected process. Generally byproduct is identified in the mid of a process or maybe at the end of the respected process account. Moving to the next point, and that is a joint cost. What is joint cost? Allocation of joint cost. Now here in some manufacturing unit, the manufacturer or a producer are manufacturing a product jointly. So that means they are manufacturing 2 or more products separated jointly, but their cost need to identified, their cost has been actually incurred jointly. Now how the cost has been actually identified of each particular process or each particular product? In this way the company has to identify their process operation first, and according to their process operations they need to require all the different processes of a product and what type of cost has been incurred in the respected process. So maybe if the certain expenditures are incurred jointly, according to the number of units, according to their object of a manufacturing, or maybe their feature of a manufacturing, the product cost or a joint cost would be allocated separately of each process. So in that way the allocation of a joint cost would be identified on the basis of features and the unit of a respected process account. So maybe there are certain expenses which are incurred jointly, but need to identify the what amount of expenditures incurred on each process allocated in a different way. Now another feature is inter-process profit costing. What is inter-process profit costing? Inter-process profit costing is, there are 2 types of profit calculation in the process account. One, maybe the profit will be charged at the end of the process accounts. It means that the profitability has been charged in the last process. If suppose taking an example that in one product manufacturing there are 3 processes. Instead of the profit has been charged in the first process, it would be charged in the last process, that is in the process 3 account. This is called a general profitability charge in the last process, and that is actually a general tendency of a manufacturer, that the profitability will be charged at the end of the process account. But suppose if the manufacturer or a producer willing to identify the some amount of profit which is to be equally distributed in each process, because of there may be a work in progress is an issue, there may be a joint cost has been issued, maybe byproducts is also an issue. So because of this reason the company or a manufacturer willing to know that the what amount of profit also equally charged in each process. In that way, or maybe they can actually identify that certain amount of a percentage of profit which has to be identified and added at the end of each process. And because of that they could actually calculated the amount of profitability added into a material cost in the each process also, or in a labor cost in each process also. So whenever the closing stock or the closing material of the respected process is identified, the profitability would be proportionately distributed in each process, instead of the profit has been charged only in the last process. What happened in the another method? In the another method, the first process and second process there would be a no profit at all. So maybe in the first process or second process there will be a loss only, and in the third process there will be a huge profit only. So this was the limitation of the one method. In the second method, what the manufacturer is actually decided, he would be identified the profitability added in at the end of each level, at the end of each department, at the end of each process, and the requisite or maybe a reasonable amount of profitability has been charged. Instead of in the last process, it will be charged at the end of every process, and it helps to identify the what amount of profitability will received at the end of the total process or at the total cost. This would be a beneficial for the company or manufacturer, and that is why the inter-process profit would be a more comfortable and more beneficial for the manufacturer, and that is why the manufacturer would charge a profit at the end of each process called inter-process profit method. This is also the one type of feature of a process costing. So, this is what we had discussed, the part of features of process accounts. Moving to the last point, and that is elements of process costing. Elements of process costing, we already discussed there are many elements of cost account, and we already discussed the elements of cost in beginning of the cost accounting only, and in the introduction part of the cost accounting, that is three major elements: material cost, labor cost and overheads. Here also these elements of process costing would be helpful to determine the process expenditures and process cost in a different level or a different stage. What would be the first part is material. How the material cost could be identified? Whatever the amount of material or a raw material has been introduced in the first process, that it will be recorded in the first process account, and at the end of each process or each costing period, that they can actually identify the amount of material cost, and material would be identified through the material sheet. How the material cost has been identified? Through the material requisitions. So, that means whenever the material has been required by the different type of manufacturing process or a different manufacturing unit, they put actually a requisitions to the store department, and according to the requisitions, the material has been supplied by the store department to the process department or in the process accounts, and in that way through the material requisition sheet they can identify the cost of material has been incurred in the respected process, would be recorded in the material or in the process account in the debit side, and to identify the material expenses. Now the second elements of cost, and that is labor. Now see how the labor cost has been identified. There are two types of labor cost. One is a direct labor and other is indirect labor. We are just supposed to discuss here the direct labor. It means the productive wages. The productive wages could be identified through the wage sheet. Now according to the how many number of workers are actually working on that particular manufacturing of unit, how many workers are involved with the manufacturing of the respected process, then their timings, their schedules, their inputs actually has been given to the manufacturing of a respected product and converted the raw material into a finished products, and at the end of that particular process they would be calculated the how many number of hours were actually used in this particular process. According to that, the what amount of wages to be offered per hour or per day, or whichever the way the wages has been calculated, and the total amount of wages cost to be identified. At the end of this particular process, the total wages cost would be calculated and recorded in the respected process account debit side. The wages cost to be recorded, that is the way to wages cost has been input in the respected process account. Now the third elements of the cost is overheads, and that overheads is actually additional expenditures or add-on expenditures of the manufacturing of unit. It means that there are certain more expenditures than the material and labor which are actually required for the manufacturing of a product. Whatever the expenditures are incurred other than the material and labor could be identified that is actually incurred for the respected process account only, and according to these expenditures would be recorded into the respected process account. Maybe add-on materials, maybe the company is actually manufacturing a textile or a clothes. In the textile division there may be a printing cost, right, or maybe there would be a block cost, and it may be there would be a cost which are actually a drying a material, drying a clothes. So these are the add-on cost and the add-on material which are actually used in the manufacturing of the respected product. So how this cost has been identified, that's the first thing. Second, in which process this cost has been incurred, and the third is what would be the value of the cost which are specifically incurred for the respected process, and according to this all calculations and all ideology, it would be recorded into the respected process account. So this is the way the overheads to be recognized, and this would be recorded in the respected process account. So these are the elements of a process costing: material, labor and overheads. In this all, we can say the whole process costing is very much helpful for the manufacturer or a producer who are involving with the number of process manufacturing product, but it's a continuous flow of a manufacturing which can be divided into a number of processes, would be helpful to apply this method to determine the cost systematically, and then they can use this method to identify the cost through the process costing method. This is the way I want to deliver the part of the process costing chapter. This is the first part. It's an introductory and the introduce of the how the process costing method would be applied. In the next sessions, we would discuss how the which are the where the problems is to be determined and how these things to be identified. Thank you very much. Namaskar.
स्वाध्याय टीवी